I brought my sister to America to help me heal. She healed my husband's bed instead. My name is Denise Whitfield, and for most of my adult life, I believed I had built something worth protecting. I grew up with very little, the daughter of parents who worked themselves thin to make sure I understood that education was the only inheritance they could guarantee me. I studied hard enough to leave home for medical school, hard enough to eventually earn a scholarship that brought me to the United States for my residency, and hard enough years later to become an attending physician at a respected hospital in Houston, Texas. Every late night, every missed holiday, every sacrifice felt worth it once I finally held my medical license in my hands. Anthony came into my life during my final year of residency. We had known each other back home, in the way people from small communities often know each other, distantly at first, through mutual friends and family gatherings, before something deeper began to grow between us during the years I spent building my career abroad. He was warm in those early years, attentive in a way that made the loneliness of building a new life in a foreign country feel bearable. When I proposed we marry so he could join me permanently in the United States, it did not feel like a transaction to me. It felt like claiming a partner who had waited patiently while I chased something larger than both of us. I want to be honest about something many people do not understand when they hear stories like mine. Anthony's ability to remain in the United States was entirely dependent on our marriage, on my visa status as a sponsoring spouse. His own legal presence in this country existed only because it was tied to mine. I did not think much about this fact in those early years. I saw it simply as a practical reality of our situation, not as something that would later become the very thread that unraveled everything. We built a life together in Houston. I worked long hours at the hospital, building a reputation as a dedicated physician, while Anthony worked various jobs, first in logistics, then eventually managing a small auto shop with a partner. We bought a modest but comfortable home in a quiet suburb, the kind of house with a 2-car garage and a backyard I always imagined filling with children's laughter one day. Our first child came after 4 years of marriage, a daughter we named Grace, delivered via cesarean section after a labor that did not progress the way my doctors had hoped. The recovery was difficult but manageable, and within a year, we were expecting again. This second pregnancy proved far more complicated. I was carrying twins, a boy and a girl, and given my body's history with the first cesarean, my doctors classified this as a high-risk pregnancy from the earliest weeks. Dr. Patricia Nguyen, my obstetrician and someone I had come to trust deeply over years of care, sat me down during one of my final prenatal visits with a seriousness I had rarely seen from her. "Denise," she said, "given your uterine scarring from the first cesarean, combined with carrying twins, I need you to understand that your body has limits it did not have before. After this delivery, you cannot treat your recovery casually. No significant physical stress. No early return to intimacy with your husband. Your body needs real time to heal, more time than most women require, or you risk complications that could threaten your life in any future pregnancy, or even independent of pregnancy altogether." I delivered our twins, Michael and Maya, via a second cesarean section that proved more complicated than my first, requiring additional recovery time and leaving me with restrictions I took seriously, both as a mother and as a physician who understood exactly what could go wrong if I ignored my own doctor's warnings. Anthony struggled with this reality more than I anticipated. In the early weeks after the twins were born, he was attentive, helpful even, waking with me during difficult nights, holding Grace while I nursed the twins, doing what a partner should do during an overwhelming season. But as weeks turned into months, and my doctor's restrictions on physical intimacy remained firmly in place, I began noticing a change in him. Small comments at first, frustrated sighs when I explained, again, why we could not resume that part of our marriage yet. Questions about how much longer this would continue. delivered with an edge I did not remember from earlier years of our relationship. "Denise, it's been 4 months," he said one evening, after I had once again gently redirected an advance he made toward me in bed. "I understand you had surgery. I understand the doctor's orders. But I'm your husband. I have needs too." "I know," I told him, exhausted in ways that went beyond simple sleep deprivation. "I'm not doing this to punish you, Anthony. My doctor has been very clear about what could happen if we're not careful. I almost hemorrhaged during the twins' delivery. I need you to understand this isn't a choice I'm making lightly." He would apologize in those moments, promise patience, hold me a little longer before turning away to sleep. But I began to sense, in ways I could not yet name, a quiet resentment building beneath his patient exterior. Something that unsettled me even as I told myself I was imagining things, that new parent exhaustion was making me paranoid about a husband who loved me. It was during this exhausting season, with 3 children under 2 years old, and my own body still healing from major surgery, that I made the decision to call my sister Renee. Renee was 7 years older than me, the sister who had essentially raised me after our parents passed away when I was still in my teenage years. She had given up her own opportunities during those years, sacrificing what might have been a different life path to make sure I finished school, to make sure I had someone showing up to my graduations and important milestones the way parents should. She had her own daughter, Jasmine, from a relationship that had ended years earlier, and she had raised that daughter entirely on her own, working multiple jobs back home while I built my career abroad, guilt-ridden every time I thought about how much easier my own path had become while hers remained difficult. When I called her, overwhelmed and desperate for help with 3 young children, she did not hesitate. "Of course I'll come," she said. "You've done so much for our family, Denise. Let me finally do something for you." I arranged a visa for her, a temporary status permitted for family members assisting with childcare needs, valid for 6 months, tied to my own status the same way Anthony's had been years earlier. I did not think twice about this arrangement. Renee was my sister, the person who had sacrificed her own youth for mine. Bringing her into my home to help during this difficult season felt like the smallest repayment I could offer for everything she had already given me. Renee arrived 3 weeks later, exhausted from the long journey but immediately diving into the chaos of our household with the same fierce competence I remembered from childhood. She took over nighttime feedings for the twins, allowing me actual stretches of sleep for the first time in months. She cooked meals I did not have energy to prepare myself. She played with Grace in the backyard while I finally found time to rest my healing body. For the first month, having her there felt like the answer to a prayer I had not even fully articulated. I noticed Anthony warming to her presence too, grateful, I assumed, for the extra hands around the house, for meals appearing on the table without needing to ask, for a household that finally felt manageable again, rather than perpetually on the edge of collapse. I did not think much of the ease between them. Renee had always possessed an easy warmth that put people comfortable quickly, the same quality that had made her such an effective surrogate mother figure to me during my own teenage years. It was near the end of Renee's 2nd month with us that I began noticing small changes I could not immediately explain. She grew tired more easily, needing to sit down during activities that had not winded her before. Certain smells from the kitchen, ones that had never bothered her, began sending her rushing toward the bathroom, door closing quickly behind her. I found myself, almost unconsciously, running through a mental checklist any physician would recognize, though I pushed the thought away each time it surfaced, telling myself I was simply projecting my own recent pregnancy experience onto every physical symptom I observed in someone else. But the signs continued accumulating, a particular exhaustion that seemed to hit hardest in the mornings, a noticeable change in her appetite, alternating between sudden cravings and complete aversions that mirrored patterns I recognized intimately from my own 2 pregnancies. One afternoon, I found her standing at the kitchen sink, one hand braced against the counter, breathing carefully through what looked unmistakably like a wave of nausea she was trying to manage silently before anyone noticed. That evening, once the children were finally asleep, I mentioned my observations to Anthony, still trying to convince myself I was imagining connections that were not really there. "Anthony, have you noticed Renee seeming unwell lately? She's been so tired, and I keep seeing signs that remind me of early pregnancy symptoms. I don't want to make assumptions, but as a doctor, I can't help noticing certain patterns." Anthony's response came too quickly, too dismissively, in a way that should have alerted me immediately if I had not been so exhausted, so trusting, so unwilling to consider the darker possibility already forming somewhere in the back of my mind. "I haven't noticed anything," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Maybe she's just adjusting to the climate here, or the different food. You worry too much about everyone's health, Denise. Not everything is a medical case." "Could you just ask her?" I pressed. "Sister to sister might feel strange coming from me, but you two get along well. Maybe she'd be more comfortable talking to you about it." "I'm not asking your sister if she's pregnant," Anthony said, an edge entering his voice that I attributed, in that moment, to simple discomfort with an awkward conversation topic. "That's between you two. It's not my place." I let the matter rest for several more days, watching Renee more closely, noticing the pattern of symptoms grow more difficult to explain away with ordinary reasoning. I found myself lying awake at night, running through timelines in my head, trying to understand how a woman who had arrived in our home only 2 months earlier, who I assumed had no significant social connections yet in this new country, could possibly be showing signs this consistent with early pregnancy. I thought about asking her directly on several occasions, gathering the courage each time, only to lose it again at the last moment, terrified of what it might mean for our relationship if I was wrong, terrified in an entirely different way of what it might mean if I was right. Finally, nearly 3 weeks after I first raised my concerns with Anthony, I found myself alone with Renee on a quiet Saturday afternoon, the children napping, Anthony out running errands. I watched her set down a cup of tea she had barely touched, her hand moving unconsciously toward her stomach, in a gesture I recognized instantly from my own pregnancies, the protective, unconscious touch of a woman already beginning to relate to what was growing inside her. "Renee," I said carefully, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you pregnant?" My sister looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes that I could not immediately interpret, before she finally spoke, her voice carrying none of the shame or uncertainty I had braced myself to witness. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." I felt something in my chest tighten, though I tried to keep my expression neutral, tried to approach this the way I approach difficult conversations with patients, calm, measured, seeking information, rather than reacting emotionally before I understood the full situation. "How far along?" I asked. "And Renee, I have to ask, who is the father? You've only been here 2 months. Have you met someone since you arrived?" Renee held my gaze steadily, none of the discomfort I expected present in her expression, something instead that unsettled me more deeply than shame ever could have, a strange, quiet defiance. "I haven't met anyone new since I got here," she said. "Denise, it's Anthony. Your husband is the father of this baby." The words landed in the quiet kitchen with a weight that seemed to physically alter the air between us. I heard myself asking her to repeat what she had just said, though I had heard every word clearly the first time, some part of me simply needing to hear it again to begin processing something my mind was actively resisting. "That's not possible," I said, my voice barely steady. "Renee, that can't be true." "You must be confused. Or maybe you were already pregnant when you arrived, and you're not accounting for the timeline correctly." "I know exactly when I got pregnant, Denise," Renee said, and something in her tone, flat, almost proud, sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of our kitchen. "It happened here, in this house. With your husband." I stood frozen at my own kitchen counter, staring at the sister who had raised me, who had sacrificed her own youth to give me a chance at the life I now stood inside of, watching her confess to a betrayal so complete it seemed to collapse every foundation I had built my adult life upon, without a single trace of remorse crossing her face. "How could you do this to me?" I finally managed to ask, my voice breaking on the last word. "After everything, Renee, after everything you've done for me, everything I thought we meant to each other." My sister's expression did not soften. If anything, something in her posture straightened, as though she had been waiting for this exact confrontation, rehearsing her response long before I found the courage to ask the question directly. "Maybe you should ask yourself why your husband needed someone else in the first place," she said. And in that single sentence, I understood that whatever I believed about my sister, about my marriage, about the family I had built with such careful, exhausting effort, none of it had prepared me for the person standing in my kitchen, carrying my husband's child, entirely unashamed of what she had done. Before we go further, please encourage this channel by subscribing if you have not. It will cost you nothing and it means everything to us. I did not know, in that moment, that the conversation I needed to have with Anthony next would reveal something even more devastating than my sister's confession. I was not ready for what he would say when I finally confronted him directly. I did not know, in that moment, that the conversation I needed to have with Anthony next would reveal something even more devastating than my sister's confession. I found him in the garage an hour later, back from his errands, humming quietly as he wiped down tools at his workbench, entirely unaware that his world was about to shift. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching a man I had built a decade of my life around, searching his familiar movements for some sign of the person capable of what Renee had just described. "Anthony," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I need to talk to you about Renee." Something in his posture changed immediately, a stillness that told me, before he even turned around, that whatever I was about to say would not come as a surprise to him. "What about her?" he asked, setting down the wrench in his hand with deliberate slowness. "She's pregnant," I said. "She told me it's yours." I watched his face for the panic I expected, the horror, the immediate denial. Instead, I watched something far more disturbing settle across his features, a kind of resigned acceptance, as though he had simply been waiting for this moment to finally arrive rather than dreading it. "She told you that," he said, not as a question. "Is it true?" I asked, my voice cracking despite every effort to hold it together. "Anthony, please, just tell me the truth. Is the baby yours?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring past me toward the open garage door, toward the quiet suburban street where children's bicycles lay abandoned on a neighbor's lawn, the ordinary world continuing on, entirely unaware of what was collapsing inside our home. "Yes," he finally said, "it's mine." I felt my legs go weak beneath me, bracing myself against the doorframe, as the confirmation I had desperately hoped would not come, landed with the same devastating weight as Renee's confession had an hour earlier. "How could you?" I whispered. "Anthony, she's my sister who raised me. How could you do this to both of us?" What happened next unsettled me even more than the confession itself. Rather than the shame I expected, Rather than the desperate apologies I had braced myself to hear, Anthony's expression hardened into something I did not recognize, something almost accusatory. "You want to know how this happened?" he said, his voice rising with an anger that felt entirely misplaced given the circumstances. "Denise, I have needs. I am your husband. For 7 months now you have turned away from me in our own bed, telling me your doctor says this, your body needs that. I am a man. I have limits too. So this is my fault," I said, disbelief overtaking the grief that had been building in my chest only moments earlier. "You're telling me that my recovery from major surgery that nearly killed me delivering our children, is somehow an excuse for you to sleep with my sister." "I'm not saying it's an excuse," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm saying a man has needs that don't simply pause because doctors give orders." Renee was here. She was willing. I am not proud of how it happened, but I will not sit here and pretend I am the only one responsible for a situation that started with you shutting me out of our own marriage. I stood in that garage, staring at a man I no longer recognized, understanding with a clarity that felt almost physical, that whatever partnership I believed we had built together over the past decade had, at some point I could not precisely identify, become something else entirely, something built on resentment I had never fully seen, entitlement I had never fully understood, and a willingness to betray me in the most intimate way imaginable, rather than simply communicate his frustration honestly. "I want you both out of this house," I said, my voice finding a steadiness I did not feel internally. "Tonight, if possible. I don't care where you go, Anthony, but I cannot have either of you under this roof another night." Anthony's expression shifted again, something calculating entering his eyes that I had never witnessed from him before, not even during our most difficult arguments over the years. "Denise," he said slowly, "think about this clearly before you make decisions you cannot easily undo. Where exactly do you think I'm going to go? My visa, my entire legal presence in this country, exists because of our marriage. If you throw me out, if you pursue anything that ends this marriage formally, you understand what that means for my status here." I had not considered this reality in the heat of my devastation, though I understood immediately that Anthony had clearly already been considering it, perhaps for longer than I wanted to imagine. "That is not my problem," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I understood the situation was far more complicated than a simple demand for him to leave. "You should have thought about your visa status before you decided to sleep with my sister." I turned to find Renee later that same evening, steeling myself for a conversation I dreaded even more than the one I had just endured with Anthony. I found her in the guest room, sitting on the edge of the bed, one hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, watching me enter with none of the shame I had hoped, even at this late stage, to finally witness. "I need you to leave, Renee," I said. "I've already told Anthony the same thing. I cannot have either of you in this house any longer." "And go where?" Renee asked, her voice carrying an edge of challenge rather than remorse. "Denise, my visa is tied to yours too. You know this. Where exactly do you expect me to go?" "I don't care," I said, my composure finally beginning to fracture under the weight of everything unfolding around me. "You slept with my husband, Renee, in my house, while I was recovering from surgery, caring for 3 children, trusting you with the most vulnerable season of my life. I don't owe you shelter. I don't owe you anything anymore." "You owe me plenty," Renee snapped back, standing now, her earlier defiance sharpening into something closer to anger. "Do you understand what I gave up for you, Denise? I raised you after our parents died. I gave up my own chances at a better life so you could finish school, so you could become this important doctor with this important house and this important husband. And what did I get in return? A temporary visa and a role as your unpaid nanny while you built the life you always wanted." That does not give you the right to sleep with my husband, I said, my voice rising now despite every effort to remain composed. Nothing gives you that right, Renee. Not sacrifice, not resentment, nothing. My sister's expression did not soften, though something flickered behind her eyes that might have been the first genuine crack in her composure since our conversation had begun. Maybe I wanted something for myself for once, she said quietly. Maybe I'm tired of watching you have everything while I raised your family and mine alone with nothing to show for it. I left her room without responding further, understanding that whatever conversation might eventually heal the rupture between us, that conversation was not possible in the raw immediacy of this particular evening. Over the following days, I consulted quietly with an immigration attorney, a woman named Sandra Whitfield, no relation to my husband despite the shared surname, who specialized in family-based visa complications. She listened to my situation with the careful neutrality of someone who had likely heard every variation of family betrayal complicating an immigration case. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, once I finished explaining the situation, "I want to be direct with you about what you're facing. Both your husband's and your sister's legal status in this country exist because they are tied to your own status as the sponsoring party. If you pursue divorce, or if you formally withdraw your sponsorship of your sister's visa, both of their statuses will be affected, likely resulting in required departure from the country within a specified time frame determined by immigration authorities. I need to understand exactly what that means," I said, "for both of them." Sandra walked me through the process carefully. Anthony's status, tied to our marriage, would be reviewed once divorce proceedings began, likely resulting in a notice requiring him to leave the country within a set period unless he could establish independent grounds for remaining, something that seemed unlikely given his limited employment history and lack of other sponsoring relationships. Renee's temporary visa, already set to expire within 4 months regardless of any action I took, would simply run its natural course, though Sandra noted that formally withdrawing my sponsorship could accelerate that timeline if I chose to pursue it. I sat with this information for several days, wrestling with decisions that felt impossibly heavy given everything already collapsing around me. Part of me wanted to end everything immediately, to file for divorce that same week, to formally withdraw every ounce of support I had extended to either Anthony or Renee. Another part of me, exhausted and grieving, and still somehow tender toward the family I had believed I was building, hesitated at the finality of decisions I could not easily reverse. In the end, practical necessity made the decision clearer than my emotions alone might have. I could not continue living under the same roof as both my husband and my sister, not while processing a betrayal this profound, not while trying to care for 3 young children amid the chaos unfolding around us. I asked Anthony to move into a rented room I arranged near his workplace, explaining to him that this arrangement would continue only until our legal situation resolved itself, that I was not yet formally filing for divorce, but needed distance to think clearly about what came next. Renee, given the complications of her advancing pregnancy and her already expiring visa, remained in our home for a difficult transitional period, though I made clear that our relationship existed now only as practical cohabitation, not as sisters, not as family in any sense that carried warmth or trust. We moved through the house like careful strangers, coordinating childcare logistics for Grace, Michael, and Maya with clinical efficiency, avoiding conversation beyond what strict necessity required. The 4 months following that devastating confrontation passed in a blur of legal appointments, difficult conversations with our respective family members back home who struggled to understand how such betrayal had occurred within our small, tightly connected family, and the exhausting daily work of caring for 3 young children while processing grief that seemed to reshape itself into something new every single day. Anthony reached out periodically during this period, sometimes attempting reconciliation, other times growing frustrated with what he characterized as my unwillingness to understand his perspective, occasionally reminding me, with an edge I found increasingly unsettling, that decisions I made regarding our marriage carried consequences for his ability to remain in the country he had called home for nearly a decade. "Denise, please," he said during one particularly difficult phone call. "I know what I did was wrong. I'm not defending it. But think about what you're doing to my entire life here. Everything I've built, my job, my friends, the community I've become part of, all of it depends on staying in this country. Please don't let one mistake destroy everything." "You slept with my sister, Anthony," I said, my patience for these conversations wearing thinner with each repeated attempt. "That is not simply one mistake. That is a betrayal that has reshaped my entire understanding of who you actually are." As Renee's pregnancy progressed and her visa's natural expiration date approached, tension in our shared household grew increasingly difficult to manage. She began expressing anxiety about her situation more openly. The reality of returning home as a single, pregnant woman with limited resources clearly weighing on her, despite the defiance she had maintained during our initial confrontation. "Denise," she said one evening, catching me alone in the kitchen during a rare, quiet moment, "I know I don't deserve your help after everything, but I'm scared about going back home like this. Pregnant, alone, with nothing to show for these months except a child whose father wants nothing to do with either of us." I looked at my sister, feeling something complicated stir beneath the anger I had carried for months, something that remembered the woman who had sacrificed her own future to raise me, standing alongside the woman who had betrayed me in ways I still struggled to fully process. "I can't fix this for you, Renee," I said finally. "I can't undo what happened, and I'm not able to offer you the kind of support I once would have given freely. But I do hope, for your sake, and for the sake of the child you're carrying, that you find stability once you return home." She nodded, tears finally visible for the first time since our confrontation months earlier, though whether they represented genuine remorse or simply fear about her uncertain future, I could not fully determine, and I found I no longer had the emotional capacity to investigate the difference. 6 months after her arrival, exactly as her temporary visa dictated, Renee departed for home, carrying a pregnancy that would forever complicate whatever relationship might remain possible between us, leaving behind a household still reeling from the damage her presence and Anthony's choices had caused. With Renee gone, I turned my attention toward Anthony's increasingly precarious situation, uncertain still what final decision I intended to make regarding our marriage, but understanding that whatever choice I eventually reached would carry consequences neither of us could easily escape. What happened to Anthony next, I never saw coming, and it would change everything I thought I understood about justice. I did not yet know that the following months would test whatever remained of my compassion for the man who had broken our marriage so completely. Nor did I understand yet how far Anthony would go in his desperation to remain in the country he had built his entire adult identity around. With Renee gone, and the immediate chaos of her departure behind me, I finally filed for divorce, a decision that had felt impossible to reach cleanly in the emotional aftermath of discovering the affair, but which now felt like the only path toward reclaiming stability for myself and my children. Sandra, my attorney, walked me through the process with the same careful professionalism she had shown from our first meeting, explaining that once the divorce proceedings formally began, Anthony's visa status would enter a review period, ultimately requiring him to demonstrate independent grounds for remaining in the country or face a mandated departure timeline. I did not file out of vengeance, though I understood Anthony would likely interpret it that way. I filed because I could no longer imagine rebuilding trust with a man who had shown me, so clearly and without remorse, exactly how little our marriage vows had meant to him during the most vulnerable season of my life. I filed because my children deserved a mother capable of modeling healthy boundaries, not one who remained trapped in a marriage built on betrayal simply because ending it carried complicated legal consequences for the person who caused the harm. Anthony's reaction, once he received formal notice of the proceedings, shifted quickly from the pleading tone he had adopted during our earlier phone calls into something closer to panic. He showed up unannounced at my home one evening, something I had explicitly asked him not to do given our arrangement, insisting he needed to speak with me immediately about what the divorce filing meant for his future. "Denise, please," he said, standing on my porch as I held the door only partially open, unwilling to invite him fully into the home he no longer had claim to. "Do you understand what you're doing? Once this divorce finalizes, I have no legal basis to remain here. Everything I've built, gone. My job, my community, 10 years of my life in this country, all of it disappears because of one mistake." "You keep calling it one mistake," I said, my voice steady despite the familiar surge of grief his presence still triggered. "Anthony, you fathered a child with my sister while I was recovering from surgery that nearly killed me. That is not a mistake in the way you keep trying to characterize it. That is a choice, repeated over time, that you made deliberately." "I know," he said, his composure finally cracking in a way I had not witnessed since our initial confrontation months earlier. "I know how badly I failed you. I'm not asking you to forgive what happened. I'm asking you to consider what happens to me if you don't find some way to help me stay." "That is not my responsibility any longer," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I recognized the particular cruelty of a situation where the consequences of his betrayal extended into territory that felt, to him at least, entirely disproportionate to what had occurred between us. I closed the door that evening without offering him any reassurance, understanding that whatever compassion I might eventually locate for Anthony's situation could not yet coexist with the raw grief I was still processing regarding everything he had done. The following months proved difficult for Anthony in ways I heard about only secondhand, through mutual acquaintances who occasionally shared updates I had not requested, but found myself unable to ignore entirely. He attempted, according to these accounts, every possible avenue to establish independent grounds for remaining in the country. He explored employment-based visa sponsorship through the auto shop where he worked, though his employer, a small operation without significant resources, could not navigate the complex sponsorship process required. He consulted other immigration attorneys, seeking any legal pathway that might exist outside our marriage, discovering repeatedly that his options were far more limited than he had ever previously understood, having spent a decade assuming his position in this country was more secure than the legal reality actually supported. I learned, through my own attorney's updates on the divorce proceedings, that Anthony had even attempted to establish a claim based on hardship, arguing that mandatory departure would cause undue suffering given his years of residence and community ties. Immigration authorities, Sandra informed me, rarely granted such exceptions absent extraordinary circumstances, and Anthony's case, however difficult for him personally, did not meet the threshold required. As our divorce proceedings moved toward finalization, Anthony's desperation grew increasingly apparent, even from the distance I had maintained since asking him to leave our home. He called periodically, his tone shifting unpredictably between pleading and anger, sometimes apologizing extensively for his actions, other times growing frustrated that I could not, in his view, separate my personal feelings from what he characterized as a purely legal problem requiring my cooperation to solve. "Denise, I'm not asking you to take me back," he said during one call, roughly 5 months after Renee's departure, his voice carrying an exhaustion I had not heard from him before. I understand our marriage is over. I accept that now. I'm only asking if there's any way you could delay the final divorce proceedings, just long enough for me to explore other options for staying here legally. Anthony, I've already delayed longer than I should have, given everything that happened, I said. I can't continue putting my own life on hold indefinitely to accommodate consequences that exist because of choices you made. Please, he said, and something in his voice, some genuine desperation beneath the request, momentarily stirred the compassion I had been actively suppressing for months. I have nowhere to go back to, Denise. My parents passed years ago. Whatever community I had back home, I lost touch with most of it after all these years away. Everything I know now, everyone I know now, exists here. I did not extend the delay he requested. Whatever compassion I still carried for the man I had once loved could not override the clarity I had reached regarding what our marriage's continuation, even in delayed legal form, would mean for my own healing and my children's stability. The divorce finalized 8 months after Renee's departure from our home. Within weeks, Anthony received formal notice from immigration authorities, informing him that his legal status in the country had been terminated alongside our marriage, and that he was required to depart within 60 days or face formal deportation proceedings. I did not celebrate this outcome, though I understood some might have expected me to, given everything Anthony had done to destroy our family. I felt, instead, a complicated grief that surprised me with its persistence, mourning not the man who had betrayed me, but the marriage I had once believed we were building together, the future I had imagined for our children that no longer existed in any form I recognized. Anthony spent his final 60 days, according to updates I continued receiving, despite my efforts to distance myself from his situation, in increasingly frantic attempts to locate any remaining option that might allow him to stay. He reportedly considered marriage to another woman, other acquaintance from his workplace, who held permanent residency status, though whether this arrangement ever progressed beyond consideration, I never fully learned. He explored asylum claims based on circumstances back home that Sandra later told me held little legal merit, given the specifics of his situation. He exhausted, by every account I received, every conceivable avenue before finally accepting that his time in the United States had reached its unavoidable conclusion. On the day his departure deadline arrived, I learned through a call from a mutual friend who still maintained contact with him that Anthony had been taken into custody by immigration authorities after failing to depart voluntarily within his allotted window. He was transported to a detention facility outside Houston, held there while final deportation logistics were processed. A reality that struck me with an unexpected weight, despite everything that had transpired between us. I did not visit him during his detention. I could not locate the emotional capacity to witness firsthand the consequences of choices that, however severe their eventual outcome, remained choices he alone had made. I focused instead on my children, on rebuilding a household finally free from the tension and grief that had defined our home for nearly a year, on returning to work with a renewed dedication that helped, in small ways, to occupy the parts of my mind that might otherwise have dwelled endlessly on everything I had lost. 3 weeks into his detention, I received a letter, forwarded through my attorney's office, written in Anthony's familiar handwriting, the same handwriting that had once filled anniversary cards and notes left on our kitchen counter during easier years of our marriage. I sat alone in my bedroom the evening it arrived, my children finally asleep, and unfolded pages that had clearly been written and rewritten multiple times, based on the various cross-outs and careful corrections visible throughout. He wrote about the shame he carried, more completely than he had ever expressed during our phone calls, acknowledging finally, without the deflection and blame shifting that had characterized his earlier attempts at accountability, that what he had done to me represented a betrayal he would carry for the rest of his life, regardless of what happened with his immigration status. He wrote about watching, from within a detention facility, exactly what his choices had cost him, not simply his legal status, but the family he had once been part of, the children he would now be separated from by an ocean, and a legal system that offered no easy path back. He wrote about Renee, too, acknowledging that whatever momentary comfort he had sought in that betrayal had cost him something he could never fully calculate: a sister-in-law's trust, a wife's love, a family's foundation, all destroyed for reasons he could no longer even fully explain to himself with any satisfaction. At the letter's conclusion, his handwriting grew smaller, more careful, the words themselves carrying a vulnerability I had rarely witnessed from him even during our most intimate years together. Denise, I am not writing to ask for anything from you. I know I have forfeited any right to request forgiveness, any claim to the marriage I destroyed so completely. I am writing simply because I needed you to know that I understand, finally and completely, the weight of what I did. I destroyed the one relationship that made my life here meaningful, and I did it for reasons I cannot fully defend even to myself. Whatever happens to me now, deportation, an uncertain future back home, none of it compares to the loss of watching my own children grow up without me present in their daily lives, a consequence entirely of my own making. I am sorry, Denise, truly and completely sorry, in a way I don't think I fully understood how to express until everything was already lost. I read that letter 3 times that evening, tears falling freely by the third reading, grief and something more complicated than simple anger mixing together in ways I had not expected to feel toward a man who had caused me such profound harm. I sat with the letter for several days, uncertain what response, if any, felt appropriate given everything that had transpired. I consulted in a moment of vulnerability with my pastor back home, a man who had known our family for years, and who listened carefully to everything I described before offering counsel that stayed with me through the difficult decision I eventually reached. Denise, he said, forgiveness does not require reconciliation. You can release the weight of carrying this anger without inviting Anthony back into the life you're rebuilding, but holding on to bitterness indefinitely will not punish him nearly as much as it will continue harming you, and eventually your children, who deserve a mother capable of moving forward rather than remaining permanently anchored to this betrayal. I wrote Anthony back a brief letter compared to his lengthy confession, acknowledging that I had received his words, that I recognized the genuine remorse contained within them, and that I forgave him, not because his actions deserved forgiveness, but because I understood, finally, that carrying unforgiveness indefinitely would only continue harming my own capacity to build a healthy future for myself and our children. I did not offer reconciliation. I did not suggest any possibility of rebuilding our marriage, even in some altered form. I offered only the forgiveness itself, a release of the anger I had carried for nearly a year, delivered with clarity that our family's future would not include him in the way it once had, but that I no longer wished to carry hatred toward a man who had, despite everything, once been someone I deeply loved. Anthony was deported 3 weeks after receiving my letter, returning to the country he had left over a decade earlier, to rebuild whatever life remained possible for him there, separated permanently from the children who had once represented his greatest source of pride. I have not spoken with Renee since her own departure, though I understand, through family members who maintain contact with her, that she gave birth to a healthy daughter several months after returning home, raising the child now as a single mother, much as she once raised me. I do not know if she carries the same remorse Anthony eventually expressed, or if she remains, even now, convinced that whatever comfort she sought in that betrayal justified the devastation it caused. Some questions, I have learned, may never receive answers I feel entitled to demand. I rebuilt my life slowly over the following year, focusing my energy on my 3 children, on my career, on reconstructing an identity that existed independently from the marriage that had once defined so much of who I believed myself to be. I returned to church regularly, finding in my faith a stability that helped me process grief I could not have navigated alone. I reconnected with old friendships I had neglected during the demanding years of medical training and early motherhood, discovering that community, chosen deliberately, rather than assumed automatically through family ties, offered its own particular kind of healing. If there is anything I would tell the woman I was before this betrayal unfolded, sitting in her kitchen watching her sister confess an affair with an expression that held no shame, it would be this: love and loyalty are not obligations owed automatically because of shared blood or shared vows. They are choices, renewed daily, that can be broken by the very people we trust most completely. But healing, even from betrayal this profound, remains possible, not through forgetting what happened, but through choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, not to let it define every chapter that follows. I brought my sister to America to help me heal from the physical toll of bringing 3 children into this world. Instead, she and my husband broke something in me I did not know could break so completely. But in rebuilding what remained, I discovered a strength I never knew I carried, a faith deepened rather than destroyed by suffering, and a peace that no longer depends on any single person's loyalty to sustain it. This has been the story of Denise Whitfield. Thank you for watching this journey from beginning to end.